Hello and welcome to Ordinary Grace. My name is Matt Guerrero and I'm your host, back for the first Ordinary Grace in very nearly a year. And while I feel like half of these intros end up being about where I've been in the time between one episode to another, that's first of all a podcast cliche. Beyond that, I really don't think I need to explain a year absence in this year of all years. And yeah, I've had a crazy year, but I think we're all having the same crazy year. And the one thing that this pandemic is allowing us to experience is a sense of community in having communal experiences. Now, obviously, since human nature is involved, we're not exactly seeing a coming together in communion of people. We still have our same divides. We have the political divides, religious divides, racial divides. And it's just as messy as anyone would expect. And I think, in fact, the frustration and the fear of not knowing exactly where we stand and what tomorrow is going to bring is driving a lot of the extreme tension, in the streets across the world. And so wherever you are, whoever you are listening, I really hope that you're safe, that your family is safe. If you've lost people, then I pray for them and for their souls and for all of us, just trying to get through it day by day. But I come back to this platform because I'm grateful to have it, and I realize that doing this podcast for the dozen or so of you who might be regular listeners is really something that has brought an immeasurable amount of joy into my life. And so, enough excuses. Let's get on with it in this year where so much has gone wrong in so many ways. This was always one of the safe places for me. And so I'm back to do it. And I also am, kind of making good on releasing a spectacular interview. It's a shame that this has waited around for a year for anyone to hear it, because I think that this is one of the most interesting interviews that I did last year is with Matt Page, who runs the Bible Films blog, has for many years, for over a decade. Also the author of the new book, The Bible Onscreen in the New Millennium. And that's a lot of what we talk about here. I mean, we get into his own personal journey, growing up Anglican, and then turning then his family went to Charismatic Evangelicalism, and then his evolution of faith through that experience as an adult, and falling away from faith even. He says some really fascinating things about what it is to lose that fixed star of faith. And beyond that, as you would guess by the film blog that he runs, we get into a lot of great discussion around film. And I love film, and it's a deep passion of mine. And one of the things I've wanted to do for such a long time is to get a chance to openly discuss more religious cinema on the show. And that's something that I'm talking about with producer Sean Woodard. And I hope that whatever direction Ordinary Grace takes, that film discussion will be a larger part of it, because it really is something that, again, like I said about even doing the podcast, brings joy into my life. And I think this is a time of so much anxiety. And yet through that, through this crazy year, I've managed to really find love and support and guidance, and to be love and support and guidance for other people. And I've also been just incredibly lucky. I don't think any one of us that's drawing breath right now in this time can be anything but grateful for all the time we have left. And I'm a praying man, and I believe in the power of prayer, but not in the sense of a genie granting 3 wishes is important. But prayer and action together is what really makes a difference in the world. And so, let's pray, and let's also do what we can to offer emotional support to those people in our lives who have to be on the front lines every day, the essential workers, the doctors, the nurses that we know and love. And right now, I just, pray that God will get us through this time and that we will help each other get through this time, because I think that's a large part of how God works in the world. Most of how God works in the world is through the ways that we treat each other. So with that said, with all due apologies to Matt for dragging this out for a year, I'm so glad to be back and to present my interview from July of 2019 with Matt Page. What spiritual tradition were you raised in, and what would you say was your first conception of God or a higher power in your youth, your childhood?
Well, for about the first 5 years of my life, my mum was a Catholic and my dad was at Church of England. Is it Episcopal over there, Episcopalians?
Yeah, I guess that's what they would call it. Anglican, Episcopalian, yeah.
Yeah, Anglican. I used to go to Catholic church until I was 5, but I don't remember that at all really. And then my parents around then decided to go for the Anglican thing, and so that really is my first memories of church and I guess spiritual stuff. And then when I was about 11, we moved again, and we moved house rather than just church, and so we started a new church there, and that was Charismatic Evangelical, quite a different change from the type of church I've been at before.
That's a huge change. What prompted that? Just that was the closest church, or your parents had a conversion of some sort?
Well, over here the Church of England's quite different. I think it's quite a broad. It's famously kind of calls itself a broad church. So you have some congregations are all the candles and the kind of old traditional music and
high church stuff.
Yeah, high church kind of stuff, and others are much more low church, charismatic, evangelical churches, Anglicans particularly, but some kind of charismatic angles. So, but I think they'd also been towards their time in their previous home. They'd also been looking at some of that. They've been going to a couple of groups who are a bit more into that, and so that was a big shift for me, and I think that was kind of a moment when it felt like some stuff slotted into place, I guess.
How old were you at this time again? How old?
I was 11, so
okay.
I was just turning 11. So, and it felt like church went from being something that was boring, that I didn't get much out of, to being something that was exciting, and I guess I to my own. And so that was more or less how it was for me until I was my kind of final year of uni, I suppose.
Right.
So.
Okay. Now, having never been to a charismatic service, what was it that when you're 11? What is it? Because I've been to Episcopalian and Catholic service, and I know they can be, especially for a child, they can be kind of very rote and feel boring So, what was it about the charismatic experience that brought you more energy in life?
I think, I'm perhaps painting a different picture from than I'm meaning to with kind of talking about the kind of charismatic element. It was definitely there, but I think what really attracted me was the music was just a bit more lively. It was kind of choruses and worship songs rather than something on an organ or something like that. And I think it was just a bit more. It just felt a bit more youthful oriented. And that was the first time I went to an event which is big over here called Spring Harvest, which is kind of it's kind of a halfway between a holiday and a festival, I suppose. Between a conference and a festival. And so that happened at around the same time, and that was when it felt like things were becoming more kind of personal to me, I suppose.
Sure.
And more that there was a relevance, I guess, of Christianity, which maybe hadn't been there before. I think up to that point, church was something I enjoyed, and then it maybe become something that I felt was a bit more me.
Right. Okay. And did that continue on into your teenage years and young adulthood, or?
Yeah, very much so. I think it increasingly defined me as a person, really.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I went away, kind of led the CU at school, and was kind of a member of a couple of Christian youth groups in my teenage years. I went away to uni and joined a church and was kind of involved there. And then in my final year, things changed again. I went to a church that wasn't kind of part of those established churches. It was more of a kind of independent church, and probably stronger on the kind of charismatic angle than previously. And the idea of that church really was particularly this thing of, I guess, of cultural relevance and being, presenting a relevant version of the gospel.
Right. So what is so dig into that a bit. What is the difference in how you were trained to present the gospel to the world there? Was the idea of just kind of being evangelical, of bringing more people into the church, or was it a more personal thing, or both?
I think in both contexts there was an understanding that faith being personal faith, but bringing people into the church was part of that as well. I think what the big change was more around the whole shape of church and the way of doing church changed, and it felt like it moved from something that was more, I guess, just the established way, and a lot of the things that are different, that are the same across congregations and traditions. Things like all sitting in rows facing the front, and had the kind of break, the style of the service and stuff. Whereas it really was that church I moved to at that point really was a complete, well, let's break this whole thing down and start from scratch in terms of what the absolute essentials of what we're about are,
right,
and how can we do those in a way that is relevant to the people around us, which was kind of students and 20-somethings. So
right.
And so it was there was a lot of rethinking the kind of traditional models and how we do things.
Was that a trying to be a reflection back on what the early Christians did, or it was trying to forge a new path?
I suppose a bit of both. So I think it was trying to capture some of that spirit of the early Christians and some of the things we read about in Acts, but also trying to do it in a new way for, I guess, a new culture and for a new group of people. And so, it was taking those principles but applying it again. Right.
And so does that, at the stage you're at in your life now, does that continue to inform you? Is that still your...
It's changed again.
Okay.
So I kind of was with that church for, between, I suppose I started going in 95, and kind of things changed there around 2011. So about 15 years. I got very involved with that church. I worked for it.
That's a long time.
The latter 8 years of it, and I've been involved in various roles. I've led a bit of worship, done a bit of Bible teaching, and kind of worked for the church as well, as I say, for 8 years. But that, I guess, things didn't end particularly well. I suppose my faith was changing a little bit as well. Changing quite a bit over those 15 years. There was never a particularly radical moment of change, but things like kind of stuff evolved as it went along, and they evolved as they went along, and I evolved as I went along, and I think we ended up in different places.
Sure. Well, sticking with your personal evolution then, what did evolve for you in terms of your understanding of the faith?
I guess I guess just levels of doubt, I suppose, on one hand, or
Sure.
understanding things from other people's perspectives, or perhaps
Yeah.
I suppose a more liberal approach than I'd kind of come across in other places. And so I'd always been kind of someone that read a lot of books on the Bible commentaries. Always had a strong emphasis on the Bible in my life, and kind of that whole thing really, which is how I got into the kind of Bible film stuff through all of that. But I guess I was always open to reading from outside my own particular tradition,
Right.
and understanding other people's perspectives on things, or trying to get other people's perspectives on things. And so and thinking stuff through a lot, just kind of constantly revisiting and revaluing stuff and thinking, does this still make sense? And it did for quite a long while. But I suppose gradually, and I think very, very gradually, different elements of things that perhaps were a very thin strand holding the whole thing together gradually changed. And so I guess around 2013-ish, I think my kind of faith moved from being something that was active to being, to really, I guess, being a faith. But I suppose it kind of felt like it was such a gradual process that even that in itself, it wasn't like I kind of suddenly woke up one day and felt, I don't really believe this anymore. It was a kind of gradual shifting, and for quite a while it was like, well, maybe I'm 55% Christian and 45% a doubter, or and then it gradually perhaps shifted to the percentages the other way, and somewhere along the line there was a lot of trying to do the stuff and hoping there'd be some new kind of level of insight or revelation that would come through. But I guess that trajectory just carried on, and so today I don't know what exactly I'd call myself today. I think I'm still certainly a friend of Christianity, and there are a lot of situations in which I'd defend it, and I guess I would, quite a sizable part of me would still hope that I can kind of re-find it, but I guess for me personally at the moment it doesn't add up, I suppose. And I feel weird about that. I find it difficult to talk about, and it feels like it's outside of the experience of most of the people I've met. Most of the people I've met have either been Christians and reasonably sure about it, although everyone always has doubts, don't they?
Of course.
A lot of people do. Or strong atheists, or not, or reason that not particularly interested because they didn't really, I guess, they didn't fundamentally believe it without having necessarily put a lot of thought into it. But that was where they
I'm always surprised how often that happens, is that these people have these deep-seated beliefs, but they've never taken the time to explore it.
No, they're just kind of, their guts or whatever, their life experience has brought them to a point where they, they've really taken it seriously, and they've just kind of continued doing that. And so, whereas I kind of feel there's certainly a good part of me that feels a bit like, well, it would, I'd like to, I'd like not to necessarily be in this situation. Apart from anything, I've invested an awful lot of my life and effort, and nearly all my adult life into this thing that I, don't currently align myself to. So it's.
Because you've been doing the Bible film blog for a good 10 years, right? And more or less. So as you are, and I definitely want to dig way deeper into that soon, but I'm just curious then, as your personal faith starts to slide away and you're so entrenched in this almost, on some level, it must be an identity of I'm the person that writes about the Bible and then also has beliefs about it too. Yeah. Has that changed? I'm very curious on how that felt on a personal level. How did your writing change? How did the way you look at what you did change? What was that process like as the evolution went in a different direction? The evolution of your faith went in a different direction than what you were writing about.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. That I think if you look at my earliest pieces on the blog, so there are some pieces there going back to 2005, 2006, and if you look at the way I was writing then, you can see a difference between some of the stuff I'm writing more recently from a faith perspective, I suppose. But at the same time, those, what I'm writing has evolved in a lot of ways as well. So it's not even that's necessarily that discernible. And as I say, I think it's been a very gradual process. So there's never been a moment where I've kind of had this. Okay, well, I used to write like this, and now I'm going to write like this. Right. And I guess what I've tried to do for a long time, going back to when I was still working for a church and being a Christian, or be a Christian with doubts, was trying to write from a point of I guess using phrases like what the Bible says or what the text says, and some people believe this about it, and that kind of language, I guess kind of inclusive language, that's always felt like an important principle to me. And always tried, I guess, for most of that time, if not all that time, I've tried to write in a way that would make sense and would not cause offence, I guess, to both Christians and atheists. So that if, because there are a lot of Bible scholars that are atheists. I guess Bart Ehrman's probably the most well-known of them, but there are plenty of people.
Bart Ehrman, someone who started with faith and then lost faith as he went along. And and various other perspectives and things. So I've never kind of really made an assumption about where people are when they find my blog. I mean, this is the beauty of the World Wide Web, I guess. Everyone is there and potentially accessing it. And so I've always tried to write from a perspective that was perhaps a bit detached, or it was trying at least to kind of be balanced and neutrality. And
bringing my own interpretation of what was being said, and I guess comparing stuff to the text rather than necessarily my interpretation of the text, or at least trying to where I was, or if I was bringing interpretation of the text, then trying to be upfront about saying, well, this is how I understand this passage. Although one of the things that I've always found very enriching about the whole thing, the whole Bible films thing, is the way that it brings its own perspectives on things and can help you to change your perspective on a passage or see your understanding of it in a different way.
Right. What was the first biblical film that really spoke to you, and how old were you when that happened?
I'm not entirely sure. I think there were 3 films that stand out for me from my childhood.
Yeah.
The first is Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes.
So that was, and we're talking about, I mean, again, we talked about this period in my life where we moved house and we started church. And I guess I saw Jesus of Nazareth just before we made that change. And I possibly saw it twice, once before and once after. I can't quite remember.
Now, this is the Zeffirelli TV movie?
One. Yeah, okay. Yeah. 1977.
Yeah.
And so I remember watching that one Easter with my parents, and that feeling like, I guess that was I guess I remember the experience. I don't remember necessarily having a Damascus Road moment with it or anything, but just that.
Right.
I remember that. And I remember also at a similar age, before we made the move, the Ten Commandments being on telly.
Of course.
And what I most remember about it actually is I was playing football in the park in the morning, and having this thing, I need to get back because I actually want to watch that. I don't know that any of the rest of my family is watching it, but for some reason I felt I wanted to watch it, and was kind of looking forward to watching it. So so I guess those are two of the most well-known biblical films, certainly I suppose for people of our generation. So I think they're the two that had an early impact on me.
Yeah. And what age do you start, I guess, really analyzing them? Is this kind of as you go into high school and college?
I think it's probably a little bit later than that. I guess I'd probably put it around 1998, 1999, that kind of time. And so by this point, this was when I was in the church that had the real drive for being relevant.
Sure.
And as I say, I was doing quite a bit of teaching at that stage on the Bible and various other bits and pieces. And I, kind of looking at, I suppose, my peers outside the church, I kind of felt that thing of, film is a great tool for communicating. It's people don't necessarily read as much as they used to do, but they do watch films, and perhaps. And I think what kind of happened with me a bit was I was trying to get away a little bit from the tradition, perhaps from the Robert Powell Zephyr version. There's a lot to admire there, but the delivery was just so slow and stilted.
Yes.
And wanted to kind of find something that was perhaps more reflective of who I believe Jesus was and who how I thought he was. And so that started a bit of a quest for that kind of thing. And then around that time, I also read a book by Philip Yancey, the Bible. No, not the Bible Jesus read. That was the other one. The Jesus I Never Knew. I don't know if are you familiar with that book?
Familiar with it. I'm not sure if I read it. It was a long time ago. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, in it he talks about this class that he used to run, where he used to have all these different Jesus films.
Yeah.
And when they were going to look at a particular passage, he would take the different films and he'd show the different versions of that passage as part of their discussion of it. And so they would kind of see like maybe kind of 5 or 6 different film interpretations of it, and then talk about what they did, what they didn't do, and how people felt about them. Yeah. And I think that was a real moment for me, I suppose, that, kind of felt like, that does sound like a good way to do it.
Yeah.
And so off the back of that, I started picking up a few more. It was the very early days of online shopping.
Right.
And so try not to drop brand names in there. But so I was actually in a position where I could picked up some of these films around 2000, 2001.
Sure.
And so films like I remember King of Kings and Great Story Ever Told, and also Last Temptation of Christ. And so I started that process then, and then I think from then on it just became a kind of one leads on to another, or you hear about a different one, and started to kind of read a little bit more about things and that kind of stuff. So I remember another one was the Jeremy Sisto one, which came out about 2000, just called Jesus. That was a mini-series as well.
Yeah.
But that was I guess that was one of the ones I felt that came closer to me in terms of who I thought Jesus was and what I thought Jesus was like.
Yeah. So that's a good question, actually, and I'm curious about this because I have that same thing when I watch a Jesus movie. There's always something in the back of my head that's not right, or or that feels right. It feels organic, especially when you read the Gospels, and he does have a slightly different character in each Gospel, of course, because of different witness interpretations. So it's interesting. Like you can watch when I watch Jesus of Nazareth, it's like, well, that feels like a very Gospel of John Jesus. He's very mystic. He's very elevated, whatever. Whereas the Jeremy Sisto, maybe that's a little more Gospel of Matthew or Luke, kind of a little more human
Yeah.
level. Here we're in the world. This is a history,
Yeah.
So which interpretation of Jesus for you, which films would you say give the best interpretation of Jesus from your own understanding of the Gospels?
Well, I think actually, I think I began to realize through doing this that actually, because that was the question I was asking originally, and that was what I was looking for originally, to try and find something that met with my own interpretation. But I actually began to realize that that was the wrong question. And I think, there were probably a few different things in the mix, but I remember reading another book which quoted a story from a saying from this German scholar Adolf von Harnack, and he was not very often people talk about biblical scholars called Adolf, but he and he used this phrase when he was looking at so in the 19th century you had lots of writers writing kind of lives of Jesus and writing
Right.
kind of novel treatments of Jesus. And a lot of them were kind of from a liberal Protestant tradition and coming up with their own takes, which were kind of selectively picking, I guess, parts of the gospel that they felt spoke to them and kind of relegating bits that they didn't feel rang true for them. And he used the phrase when he was talking, having looked back at all these different versions of it, and said, actually the face that begins, as they peer down the well at who Jesus was, the face that begins to come back to them is actually just the reflection of a liberal Protestant face.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
and actually, as they're looking at these, as they're trying to write their own, project their own versions of Jesus, what they're really doing is they're kind of producing versions of themselves,
of course,
that are slightly more Jesus-y. But essentially, that's what was going on. And so I think I began to realize around then that actually this is trying to find a Bible film that meets with my own version of Jesus is just that in the 21st century,
right?
And actually what I should be after more is those versions that challenge who I think Jesus is,
right?
Because and send me back to the text and make me think, okay, well, what does the text actually say? Why? How am I? I've come to this conclusion. Why have I come to that conclusion?
Yeah.
So that was quite a step change for me, I guess. And it became this thing of preconceptions. We all have preconceptions about who Jesus is, and that can come from a number of all kinds of different sources. But fundamentally, we always have things. But actually, how many of those things are rooted in the Bible, and how are rooted in other things, be it our own we have about faith, or when we're worshipping, or just what's coming through as culture, or from our churches, or from how other people who've been on similar journeys have expressed it. And so that was quite a thing for me. And so then I guess if anything, that just kind of propelled me more in that way. And I guess two films around that time that I became aware of were two different versions of the Gospel of Matthew.
Yes.
And so one of those was an Italian film made by quite famous Italian director called Pier Paolo Pasolini in 1964. And the other one was the version made by the Visual Bible in 1994. A guy called Bruce Marciano was there as a very kind of very, very smiley, happy Jesus.
Right.
I guess having being much closer to the Jeremy Sisto one.
Yeah. Pasolini's Jesus is not smiley. No, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting.
It's just the thing. He's kind of he's famously thought of as a very angry kind of Jesus. He's kind of, Pasolini was a Marxist, and there's kind of people are always very quick to point out this kind of similarly kind of driven revolutionary leader type Jesus behind him.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think those two films are particularly stark reminders of the fact that they're both based on the same words,
Mm-hmm.
and yet they produce two such radically different Jesuses from those
Yes.
two words. And so why is it? Why does one of these appeal to me more, and the other one appeal to me less? Why is it I could show, depending on who groups of people are, I could show them the same clip and reciting the same words, and some of them would say, "Oh yeah, Jesus, this one is the right one," and others would say, "This one is the right one." And so that became a very kind of nourishing thing for my faith. Then it became very much about, okay, actually, I don't want to be basing my faith on this kind of preconception or my my kind of these other ideas of who I think Jesus is. Who is Jesus really? Who is the kind of the character that I find in the text and the things he's saying, and how much of how I imagining him is him.
Right.
Him is me just to kind of create a kind of Jesus that's like a better version of me.
Yes. Yeah.
Rather than who he really was.
Yeah. What other films were really good at challenging your vision?
Well, I've mentioned one of them already,
right.
And that was Last Temptation of Christ.
Yes.
And I guess this was perhaps one of the first films that made me look a bit more inward and think that doesn't sit with my own experience at all. I mean, it was very interesting watching that film. I remember hearing about that film when it first came out. It came out in 1988. For those who don't know it, it's a Martin Scorsese film. And I was 13 at the time, so I was old enough to kind of my faith was my own to some extent, and I was old enough to kind of pick up some of the stuff that was being discussed about it, but obviously not enough to see it.
So a lot of protests when it came out. Yeah. At least in the U.S. I don't know about the U.K., but
there were protests. There were some protests over here, although probably in kind of quite a British. Careful now, we're not entirely happy with this kind of thing. Rather than I think in France they had a theatre firebomb, didn't they? But so I wasn't able to see that film at that stage because I was too young, and it actually took quite a long time before I got around to watching it for various reasons, because of the protests, I guess, and because I was, when it came out, I remember it coming out when I was a boy. I was 13 when it came out, so I was old enough to my faith was my own, and I was kind of getting reasonably mature, but I was not old enough to see it. So it was not something that was over here in Britain. We have a slightly different system from you. You have the kind of R-rated system where a parent can take you to see it, and whereas here it was classified as an 18, which meant you couldn't go and see it until you were 18. But I remember hearing discussion about it on Radio 4, and thinking that it sounded like it was interesting concepts, and that I could kind of see what perhaps the direction would do. But even when I turned 18, for quite a few years afterwards, I steered away from it, perhaps because I was concerned about some of those issues and some of the reasons that had been talked about. But eventually, I partly out of interest, partly because I was starting to look into this thing more, partly because I've heard a few Christians that I respected talking about it and saying this perhaps is a film we should engage with, and maybe it's not.
That's right.
Saying what a lot of the people that protest about it say. So I kind of decided to make my own decision on it. And it was a combination then of, in terms of watching it, of there being some bits of it that I just thought, oh yes, that was brilliant. So there's a bit where Mary Magdalene's getting stoned, being adulterous, and Jesus kind of steps into that situation, and there was a real, that it kind of really made the hairs on your back of your neck stand up, because there was a real tension and a vitality to the scene. and then Jesus goes off and he delivers a version of the Sermon on the Plain from Luke's Gospel. And again, there was this kind of vitality about it, but there are also other bits that I, particularly didn't like.
Right.
And again, and then this, this kind of came back to me as well. And so I was kind of caught. That was one of the films that was making me think, well, why do I think these bits are right, and why do these bits feel wrong? And some of them, I guess, were wrong because they're fiction.
Sure.
Both the book and the film claim they're fiction. They don't claim to be how it really happened type thing.
Right.
But I think even so, it's just kind of interesting. Different reactions. What do some of these, even with the bits that were more biblical, why do I feel happy with how he's reciting that bit of the Bible, but not with that bit, And so that was one of the ones that made me think in this sense. And again, this kind of process of re-examining and looking at stuff.
Right.
And then I guess another one was a film that came out in 2006. Oh, well, in fact, there were two films that came out in 2006. One was called Son of Man. It was a South African film, and it was a modernization. And Jesus was a kind of a black activist in the country was unnamed. It was essentially a version of South Africa,
right?
Or an African kind of state, and kind of speaking out against presenting Jesus very much in opposition to the kind of the authorities there.
Right.
And
that sounds fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting film, and there's been quite a lot of scholarship around it subsequently.
Yeah.
The same year, there was another film that wasn't a modernization. It was called Colour of the Cross, but it also had a black actor playing Jesus. And this film was a bit more upfront in advance about talking about the idea of Jesus being black.
Yeah.
Specifically, rather than just non-Caucasian, non-white.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't, I think, from a kind of film point of view, it wasn't as good a film.
Sure.
But I think I continue to think about those two films partly because the filmmakers of the second film had such a strong conviction, really, or had a reasonably strong conviction about the idea of Jesus being black, and just the whole thing of kind of representation and the kind of, I guess, issues of ownership around that, and again this thing of there were certain passages that they were talking about that I had never thought of in the light that they were talking about them.
Right.
And I didn't and I don't accept their interpretation of it, but it was still very interesting to see people that did.
Right.
And I guess I still think about the different reception of those two films, which came out at the same time. It was in the aftermath of the Passion of the Christ, and one of them, as I say, has had a lot of scholarship written about it and a lot of discussion because it recontextualizes Jesus as being black. And the other film, portrayed, actually goes more on the lines of the fact that Jesus was black, and I'm still kind of, I think I don't know. I think there's something within that about, I haven't quite been able to put it to words yet. One day I'll get around to actually putting it together, but I haven't got it clear in my head, so perhaps I should go into it now. But I just find it the reception of those two films. That the second film was all but forgotten, and the other one is very much kind of talked about as being a popular reinterpretation of it. Right. And yet I'm not sure in terms of, I think that the Colour of the Cross film is perhaps the more radical translation that perhaps should be challenging our society with all its issues of race and all its problems with race relations in both our nations. But I haven't managed to get to the bottom of that yet.
Right.
Maybe if I ever figure it out, maybe you can have me back on and I'll talk you through it.
Yeah, we'll follow up. Yeah. So it's hard to talk about films, certainly in the last, generation, the last 20 years or so, about Jesus without talking about the Passion of the Christ, which is such an extreme vision, obviously.
Yeah.
What is your own personal take on it? It seems also to me to be an extraordinarily Catholic version of Jesus, but also a very extremist Catholic version too, in many ways. So what is your own personal experience of that movie, and what do you make of it as a vision of Jesus?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's an awful lot to go into it.
That's a lot, right? Yeah.
I mean, I think the stage I was at when I first got wind of the fact it was coming, I suppose it was 2002, 2003. Yeah. So I was very excited about it as a possibility. Mel Gibson was still was still running off the back of Braveheart, I think.
Right.
And still had a good reputation, and was a credible filmmaker. And so that was my anticipation of it. Then there was a lot of discussion about the issues around the anti-Semitism of it, and that was quite a learning experience for me. I think picking up an awful lot of the discussion about that and getting a better understanding of that, really. And then it was and then there was the experience of watching the film itself, and then reading another lot of takes on it and what people thought about it. So my own take on it. I think I mean he's from a very traditional Catholic perspective that is not representative of most Catholics today, certainly not in the Western world. I think what I found interesting about it, I suppose I should start by what I liked about the film.
Sure.
And I think there's a lot of really good filmmaking craft in there. It's kind of very effective in what it does. I like the kind of the use of Aramaic. I think Jim Caviezel gives a really, I can never pronounce his name, gives a really good performance. As Jesus, in as much as we see him.
Right.
And and there are. I mean, I guess like Less Temptation, there are bits that feel that feel brilliant. But I think there's also an awful lot of Mel Gibson's own personal things. For me, cloud the film too much. I think it's very interesting. I mean, again, we've been talking about the issues of people bringing their own personal baggage to these films, and I guess it's very interesting because I see, having looked at the film a lot and discussed it a lot, I see an awful lot of the aspects that Mel Gibson brings into it that I think a lot of people just miss. And so, for example, there's an awful lot of kind of horror elements within the film that people tend not to kind of realise. And then when you go back and say, well, you've got the bit where the little kids turn into demons, and you've got the bit with the devil character is carrying this kind of baby, and you've got this kind of blue moon type lighting in the first scene, and you've got the bit where where Judas is sent mad by these kind of demonized children. There's kind of all these different elements, and people then people start to see, there are these elements from elsewhere. And similarly, one of the sources that informed the film is Catherine Ann Emmerich's visions. She was a 18th, 19th century nun. And again, when you know a bit about them, it's much clearer how much they've influenced the film. There's a bit
and certainly things like the Shroud of Turin and stuff like that as well.
But so there's a bit like in as Jesus has kind of been nailed to the cross but hasn't yet been put up, that they flip the cross over. And if you watch very carefully, and also if you look at some of the publicity stills for it, the cross is kind of, it doesn't hit the ground. Jesus doesn't go face ground into dirt. The cross is kind of like hovering off the ground. And, it's just a brief thing and you would kind of miss it. But actually, this is straight out Emmerich's writing. There's quite a lot there like that. And so similarly, you kind of get some of those elements. And I think the anti-Semitism thing, again, some of these aspects are so reinforced by other Jesus films, and this is the downside of watching a lot of Jesus films, that they can reinforce bad things as well as errors as well as introducing good things. But you kind of see things like, we have two characters here. We've got the character of Caiaphas, we've got the character of Pilate, and the Bible tells us nothing about what they look like, and yet you kind of have this Caiaphas who is almost there's almost kind of very subtle hints of kind of Jabba the Hutt about him.
Yeah.
I mean, something I wrote about ages ago.
Yeah.
But just like the way his house, which feels very like kind of Jabba's lair. You've got these kind of guards whose costumes are quite similar, and the lighting is very similar, and you've got the kind of cackling, kind of sycophantic friends in court around him, and he's quite kind of he's not a kind of slim trim guy, and he's got this.
That's right.
And he's not an attractive actor. And then you've got the character playing Pilate as this kind of refined, noble-looking Roman who's kind of wandering around with blowing sheets in his kind of open space palace, and pulling very kind of thoughtful looks and speaking very measured tones. And all those elements are completely outside of the Gospels.
Well, and especially what we did know of Pilate from history was how brutal he was.
Yeah, well, yeah, and from the Bible as well. I mean, Luke 13, 1 or 2, I can't remember, but those verses talk about how basically, he kind of butchered a load of people that were, making sacrifices.
That's right.
And in the temple, and he went in and, killed a load of them. And this is the kind of portrayal of Pilate we have, and yet. Nearly always actually in these films, he's kind of portrayed as this, what is truth? And he's kind of stroking his, he doesn't have a beard.
He's David Bowie.
yeah. And he's kind of asking, he's kind of very measured, moderate thing. And so, and that tends to kind of put that emphasis for, who killed Jesus back onto the kind of the more just likable characters, which are often, again, Caiaphas could have been a male model for all we know, but,
right.
And so there are various elements like that that I have problems with the film, I suppose as well, and the kind of the level of violence I sometimes don't like, and I sometimes think is perhaps fair enough.
Sure.
So that's just some of the things.
I know we could go on for a while about that, it does bear discussion.
It's obviously it's a film because, as you say, it's so well known, and it's the film that dominates the discussion these days. It's the film I've thought about and talked about a lot, but if you go to my blog, there's quite a lot of different posts on it.
Sure.
If you away that.
So, just kind of in summation, as we talk about your journey and especially, kind of your understanding of film, because you've gone through this personal evolution, when you approach, say, a new biblical movie or an old one that you haven't seen, when you're approaching it for the first time, now, at this stage in your evolution, what does it give you versus what it might have given you, 10 years ago, 15 years ago?
That's quite different. That's a difficult question. I think because I think obviously as I've watched more and more, there's less and less new territory to break. So even if my faith hadn't evolved through that process, the chances of finding something, but have reduced. But I guess I still like it when I see something that makes me think, I hadn't seen that little verse there before, and that completely changes. This director's picked this out, and I've never thought of it like that before. and I still get moments of that. And so I really like that. And again, I guess, and more broadly, just that idea that this is someone trying to do new things or bring a new angle on the characters, and make us think about things in a new way from our own experience,
right.
And make the characters more 3D, even if they themselves are not necessarily the full picture. So
Sure.
last year, for example, we had Mary Magdalene, which I think, from a kind of, there are various issues you could raise with it from a biblical criticism, textual criticism point of view, but also as a kind of exercise in looking at some of these issues and what the gospel means, particularly to women and what it meant to them, and how Jesus relates to women. I thought was really good, and I know a lot of, I know various kind of women that saw that film and it really spoke to them, without them necessarily taking it on as, well, this is now my new version of the gospel. It just kind of, on a deeper level, I suppose, it kind of something resonated with them, about that film, and so I guess I'm interested when I find those things. I think, one of the things I love about film is its ability to move us and to challenge us and to make us think about life and some of the important questions in new ways. And that's not just biblical films. That just happens to be my speciality, but all films do that, or not all films, but perhaps all good film.
Now, I'm curious. Once upon a time, you might have spoken, and maybe this is more American evangelical language than UK, but of having a relationship with Jesus. At this point in your life, do you consider yourself to be in a relationship with Jesus of any type?
I guess I know that we do have that term over here.
Okay.
And I would have used it before, and I guess I probably wouldn't now. I have an interest in him as a inspiring character from the past.
Sure.
And I mean, but having said that, there are moments when I pray, and and whilst I suppose the inspiring character from the past thing feels very much more detached from the situation that I am. It's still, I still think about Jesus, and the other characters in the Bible are an awful lot more than any other historical characters from the past.
Right, yeah.
And
you wouldn't ask Julius Caesar for guidance.
No.
Maybe you could, but
I'm not sure. I'd get any very
far.
Right. And I think even now, and I guess I probably would say, well, I don't feel that I necessarily would. I don't feel overall that I'd get that far asking that question of Jesus as well.
Right.
But I think it's still part of me.
Yeah.
Part of my gut, part of my natural tendency, still would ask those questions, and or still might feel that there might still be something in that, and it, and I guess, as I say, part of me still hopes that perhaps there is, but yeah.
Now I do ask people who are comfortable to do that, to close out with a prayer. Do you feel comfortable closing this with a prayer?
I think I'll be happy for you to close us with a prayer while I'm still here.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. I just thank God for bringing us together for a discussion, especially a discussion about film, which is a passion of mine and a passion of yours. And I appreciate the chance to deepen my understanding of who Jesus was, and for me continues to be. And I thank you, Matt, for being on the show.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Don't really want that much of no never ever asked for more than anything I feel that I should get, and yet.
All right, that was my interview with Matt Page. And thank you, Matt, for your patience. I apologize again. And thanks for being on the show and sharing your perspective. And please do check out Bible Films blog and Matt's new book, Bible Onscreen in the New Millennium. And I'm wary of making big proclamations about what is ahead or what my plans are. You know, Sean and I are deciding on some new directions for the show. But mostly I want to talk to people again. So, you know, ordinarygracepodcast@gmail.com. Drop me a line. I'm on Twitter at GuerreroPMG. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes because that will help so many more people see it. But also, if you could, share it. Share our links. Share our videos. I think we'll have video content. Each episode will go to YouTube now. So if that is a better way for people to hear the show, then please share it. So I'll be back soon. Until then, I want to close out the show and every show with the words of my great mentor, Susan Pierce. God bless you, and may you be happy, may you be safe, may you be healthy, may you be free.
Wondering when it's time to quit. Wishing we could stay all day like little children. But they say it's time to go. Yeah, no, you'll never fit. Oh, roller coasters, bigger motors, a better life. Famous friends make better